Good afternoon, everyone, and apologies for being a bit late. We've, at the moment, excuse me, got a technical problem with one of our panelists, Greg, but hopefully he's going to be able to join us very shortly. So I'd like to welcome you all to this Fusion21 webinar, looking beyond the pandemic. It's exactly 12 months ago, the 12th of May last year, when this panel came together and did the first of a number of webinars we did on the emerging crisis, the emerging pandemic, when we were all locked down in May last year. I think little did we know that we'd still be in a partial lockdown and that we've endured 12 months of this strange way of working. Fusion has remained committed to working with you, our members, and again, we're delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today. So in terms of just moving sort of straight on and to introduce the panel, obviously delighted that Jenny, Steve and Steve are with us, and as I said, hopefully Greg will be able to get over the technical issue that we currently have, and he will be able to join us shortly. But what I wanted to do was, again, just a little reminder to you, the audience, that, you know, whilst you're on mute and the usual, we do want to hear from you. So if you do have any questions or comments, please do feel free to you know, let us know your thoughts and questions for the panel as we go along. But in terms of the question, I'm going to sort of go straight in and sort of talk about the effects that the pandemic has had on the organisations and so on. And basically, let's start with you, Jenny. Obviously, the voice of the tenant has perhaps been more difficult to hear over the last 12 months, but it's clearly something that's top and a key priority for everyone. I just wondered if you could start by sort of sharing your insights on the last year and what those and your priorities for the year ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, yeah, happy to try and do that in a few minutes. Thank you for asking me today. I think I'm gonna start. I've got about 4 or 5 different points. I just want to get conversation going. I think I absolutely just want to start with. I want to start with the white paper, and which isn't sort of in some ways directly about the effects of the pandemic, but the white paper landed sort of halfway through in November last year, while we were all grappling with all of this. And you know, from a tenant engagement perspective, pandemic or not, this is going to change how we do things with our customers in the future. It's the proactive consumer regulation that we were calling for, along with many in the sector. I'm generally very pleased with the white paper and what it set in motion. I think. And a lot of the reason for that is because it's definitely, we could see it came from what tenants have been saying since Grenfell in particular. So very pleased to see that. What we've seen obviously over the last year, it was already happening even pre the pandemic in terms of the change in focus on complaints, and that's continuing. And to see that the profile of the Housing Ombudsman is really high. We've been very pleased to see what the Ombudsman's doing. You only have to look at the fact when they've called out for their tenants panel recently, the level of interest that they've had in people wanting to be on that panel. I think it was about 600 in the end they've got on this kind of wider panel. That shows to me that we've got a sector that really has to get to grips with taking complaints seriously, and we have to get our processes right again, because it was spoke so much at the roadshows by tenants. We've got the regulator of social housing everywhere. You can't go to an event in housing at the moment without hearing from the regulator, can you? But an absolutely new direction, really focusing minds across sectors for tenants and for landlords and for contractors as well. And we're involved in lots of the stuff that's going on, particularly around tenant satisfaction measures and how are they going to spin out. And it feels like it's being done in a very collaborative way, really taking the time to listen to what the sector thinks will work. And certainly what will work for tenants. I think the stuff in the white paper around accountable persons, for consumer regulation and for safety is really, really good step forward, and something again that tenants were really pleased about. So I'm sure we'll come back to the white paper and regulation, so I won't dwell on that. I think just talking about a few different things as well, what we've seen. What we're increasingly seeing at TPAS is a recognition that tenant involvement now is going to be needed across the business. This isn't just something niche over here. This isn't something that some department does. You're going to need in your organisations some people understanding the importance of the customer voice across every part of the business. And we're certainly working with customers more in asset management, in development, in repairs, to really understand and hear that. It's of course going to be paramount across some of the big agendas we've got coming at us in terms of building safety, how tenants are going to be involved in net zero carbon, the language, the product development we need to do in conjunction with tenants to make that land, and just general awareness raising. Decent homes, you know, again, part of the panel for that, the expectations from tenants about how we're going to meet those, particularly because we've all recognised, haven't we, a lot more the importance of home and what home means for us, and the fact that now many of us, as well as many tenants, are going to be working from home for the long haul. What will that mean for both how tenants are engaging with us, but how we have to provide our services for those tenants as their lifestyles change as well? Very quickly, I'll just speed through a few others because I see Greg's arrived as well, which is great. I mean, digital engagement. I mean, I think we can probably come back to this, but I think digital engagement has been the huge step forward, hasn't it, from a tenant perspective, both with the sector. So I've never seen so many tenants at sessions where the regulator's speaking, MHCLG, the Ombudsman. That's not going to change. Tenants directly hearing from decision makers. A massive social media increase in tenants talking with each other and tenants networking with themselves across social media, and that's here to stay. And I think the media focus is also here to stay. We've all seen the recent programmes that have been going on, what's been highlighted in tenants' flats, particularly down in London. I think that relentless focus is going to stay, and it's going to be part of something the sector has to grapple with. Massive increase in digital engagement with tenants, with their landlords. So internally in an organisation, and we can talk a bit more about this if you want, but you know, we're seeing, you know, faster meetings, more accountable meetings, more tenants able to be involved, very different tenant demographics coming forward because they can get involved in different ways. Even simple things like taking advantage of the TVs in sheltered schemes to actually put tenant engagement messages on, so that people can hear those together. We're not just putting pinning things on notice boards anymore, are we? We're taking advantage of the TVs and everything in people's homes. It's hugely levelling, I think, that tenants can have that same access to people as other people in. And I think what it means is, one of the effects of this is we can really start to think about the appropriate means to engage with our tenants in the future. We're choosing which ones we want to do. I think there's going to be, I think the other effect of the pandemic is the pressure on us to make sure we're hearing from a much wider range of voices, whether that be face-to-face when that's appropriate, through digital means, but actually through our data and insight. We've got to increase our diversity. We've got to hear the lived experience more, and I think that did drive some of the services that we delivered, certainly in the early days of the pandemic last year. We heard what people were experiencing, we heard the pressures they were living with, and we put our services directly to help them, and I think we can do more than that. And I just think generally customer expectations, whilst we had probably a little bit of a hands-off period last year where people were very forgiving of what we did as providers, now I think customer expectations generally are just going to go higher and higher and higher. People want things faster, don't they? But they want that with a very responsive and caring organisation as well. They want their landlord to take account of the pressures they've been under. But I think I'm going to just end on saying nothing's changed in some ways, because we've got to focus relentlessly on getting the basics right, and that still has to remain the priority for the sector.
Excellent. That's a great introduction, and I'm relieved that Greg's been able to join us. But I'll just leave you to get your breath, and I'm going to move on to you as Steve Coffey. Last time you sort of talked about, I can't remember if it was the 3 R's or the 4 R's, about how Torus was going through this process of response, resilience, recovery. And I think Renaissance was your fourth R. You know, how's it been for Torus, and how do you see particularly, you know, maybe that Renaissance phase?
Yeah, thanks Andrew, and welcome everyone. sort of, so I suppose for me, and I'd like to just pick a point Jenny finished with there as well. I think tenants have been remarkably forgiving and sort of, working with associations and communities more generally. But I think at the same time, I don't think we should underestimate our sector has been fabulous through this pandemic. The stuff we've done to help communities and help individuals, from physical activities to mental health and well-being and everything right across the piece. And I do think, whether it's getting food out to people and everything, I think the way our sector's mucked in has been fabulous. I think it's something we should be very proud of, notwithstanding the fact that, there's some significant challenges around disrepair and other things as well that, the sector's got to deal with, without a doubt. And I think that has shown politically that, the politicians accept that when the chips were down, our sector has come forward and rallied itself to contribute. And I think that's certainly been the case in the Northwest where we are, and we're sort of, a landlord just based in the Northwest, about 40,000 homes. But we've been hit right across the piece that within our group, we've also got, for instance, a £70 million commercial contracting business, which, saw it's like everyone else in the contracting sector. And I don't want to steal Steve's thunder, but, work dried up and to a trickle overnight, didn't it, in many ways. And so that business sort of suffered as much as anyone else. But we've also got a £10 million turnover charity, our Torus Foundation. And I think there's a few things there that allows us to sort of look at that scope of response that the sector needed to have and did in fact have. And last time, Andrew, you're right, we talked about a 4-phased approach around respond. It was just make sure the wheels don't come off at the beginning. That seems a long time ago, doesn't it? But it happened overnight, and we needed to make sure the wheels didn't come off, and we need to respond quickly, and we did. I think as a sector, we did that resilience, looking to the recovery, and now I suppose Renaissance, we come up with reimagining as a more snappier approach to the new future. And I suppose skipping ahead, I suppose we're all looking at, agile working is one of the key phrases now, isn't it? I think agile working is only second to you're on mute in every meeting I go to. So, it certainly is sort of what everyone is looking at, and quite rightly so. But I think through those phases, we did look at those different sections. And I think because our model is based upon our commercial businesses making significant money and gift aiding £5 million a year to our charity, and that was under threat. But precisely at this time through the pandemic was exactly the time that our model, our gift aid model, our social dividend model, is precisely the time it's needed when it was under challenge because the commercial sides of the business were under pressure. So our board stepped up to the plate and said, well, actually, we need to put more money in, because the whole principle of we need to make sure people can get through the pandemic, we can get employment opportunities for people, we can deal with people's isolation, we can make sure that people are financially and digitally included so that they can respond to things going forward. And I think that's been a key focus for us. And going forward, that's even more so, I think, as people settle down to a new norm. I think as well, it is very different because the levelling up agenda is a key one, obviously economically across the country, but north-south in terms of levelling up, that is something key as well. And recognising that people are going to spend more time at home. So the public realm is more important than it's ever been. Space standards are more important than they've ever been, and people are working at home. All of those things that we need to take cognizance of to make sure that we're dealing with those kind of green issues, as well as the zero carbon, MMC, retrofitting, and all of those things. And the final thing I'd finish on going forward for us, it is before we started, we were sort of talking amongst ourselves, this digital way of engaging is fabulous, and we wouldn't have got through the sort of the pandemic, would we? But people are really important, and I think housing's about people, and people's welfare, health and well-being is immensely important. And just on a personal level, I lost my own mother through the pandemic to COVID, and it's I'm not saying that's anything special, by the way. It is in our family, obviously, but there's hundreds of thousands of families across the country who are in similar circumstances. And I think that just shows that the health and well-being, the rounded sense that we can play a massive part in our communities, is really important for us and our tenants and our customers, but also getting the economic proposition right so that we can level up, that people have got more economically active, so that we can all reap the rewards and the benefits that we get in that. So for me, they're the key challenges going forward for us.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Steve. So, Greg, welcome again. Last year, you shared with us the insights from the CEO WhatsApp group that Campbell Tickell had set up. I wonder, I mean, I understand that the WhatsApp group is continuing and growing and so on, but what are the insights that they're currently talking about, again, now as we've sort of moved on those 12 months?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for the technical glitches earlier. There's always one, isn't there? It's unfortunate when you're on the panel, but hey. Yes, as you say, Andrew, Campbell Tickell set up a WhatsApp group for chief execs before the first lockdown, because we were conscious of the need that many people were expressing about the importance, the value of having a sort of safe space for confidential discussions, because everybody was in the same position at the same time and having to make enormous numbers of changes. The group is still continuing. I mean, we've got over 220 CEOs of housing organisations, ranging from some of the largest in the country through to many small and specialist organisations, homelessness organisations, supported housing and care bodies, ALMOs, and so forth. And that's right across the UK and also into the Republic of Ireland. In fact, the group has actually been discussing in the last few days whether, you know, as we move beyond COVID, there is still a value for the group. And what's been interesting is virtually 100 of them, 100 of the CEOs who've come back and said, yes, it's really valuable to be able to share, to operate in partnership, if you like. I mean, echoing what Steve's just been saying, I think one of the big takeaways for me as far as the housing sector is concerned is the openness to partnership. And we're talking about partnership with not just between associations and ALMOs and providers, but also with local authorities, health, care, voluntary sector, contractors, and so on. I mean, what have people been talking about today? It's all a bit random. Yes, of course, they've been talking about agile working and who's got a plan for it. So you're right again on that one, Steve. But at the same time, they've been talking about, you know, do we think long service awards for staff are a good idea? Apart from that, over recent weeks, there was obviously a lot of discussion about the most recent lockdown, which we're thankfully coming out of, and the effects of that. You know, tougher than the previous lockdowns, the effects of that for leaders, staff, residents, which services can be maintained, sickness levels, vaccinations and testing. But sort of thinking more beyond that, a number of the big takeaway areas, mental health. I mean, mental health has always been a huge issue for everybody. You know, the received wisdom has always been that somebody will experience, one person in 4 will experience mental health issues at some point in their lifetime, and that's come much more to the fore over the last year or so, linked to issues around loneliness. And how do we address that? How do we build on it? How do we respond to it? Social care is another area that people have been talking about. Obviously, we had the Queen's speech yesterday, and it's hard to tell whether social care is still in the long grass or not. Government's been promising for quite a long time to come up with a white paper. They still seem to be promising it, but we're really not quite sure. Diversity and inclusion, and the sense that this is not just a 2020 Black Lives Matter issue. Black Lives Matter brought many of these issues to the fore internationally, but how can housing organisations for whom issues of diversity and inclusion are or should be front and centre, how can we ensure that that's the case? How can we build on that? New working practices, but you know, the future of the office, how's it going to be used on a hybrid model, which is what most people are talking about. But this all, of course, links to longer term planning, because in the future there are going to be more crises, whether we like them or not. On average, I think we get a pandemic about every 6 years. Well, let's hope we're a bit better prepared for the next one. But of course, the next crisis might be something else entirely. It could be a climate disaster, or it could be economic, or whatever. How can we ensure that our organizations can cope with whatever it is? We've seen something like what one might say is between 5 and 10 years worth of changes concertinaed into 1 year. How much change can people cope with? What else have people been talking about? A lot of discussion around financial challenges. What kind of recession have we got? How long is it going to last? What about expectations around unemployment spiking as furlough is withdrawn? What about the effect in terms of homelessness as we see demand and inequality continuing to increase? In terms of social landlords' business streams, effect on rent arrears, effect on bad debts, especially as unemployment increases. What about the effect of all of the, you know, most organizations seem to have their repairs under control, and they don't have huge backlogs that they are conscious of. But I'm reminded in that of what was being said a few months ago about a colossal reduction. This is in the health service. This is just as an example. Colossal reduction in the number of referrals of cancer cases, because essentially people didn't want to present with those issues, drastic as they were, because they were afraid of getting COVID, or because, you know, the focus of care or healthcare was elsewhere. Could we similarly have a huge amount of catch-up work on the repairs side as things continue to unlock? My guess is we will. So, you know, what are going, all sorts of effects there. It could be more than just catch-up work, because something that would have been a routine repair might have become urgent, or an urgent repair might become an emergency by the time it's dealt with, and that has an effect on what it costs. Issues around what Ipsos Mori are calling Brexodus, costs and availability of both of parts and products for construction and repairs and maintenance, but also availability of staff to carry out repair works, to build the new homes we need. Speculation around government policy. Might we be seeing another rent cap? How fundable is the shared ownership model? What about the future of Section 106 and what is going to replace it? On the positive side, there's obviously prospects for savings in areas like offices and travel, and at the moment borrowing is very cheap. But what this kind of all leads to, particularly when you take account of the building safety issues, is, you know, costs of fire safety works, building safety bill, building safety regulator, new regulator for construction products, focus on consumer regulation, as Jenny touched on, rise of the Ombudsman and the increase in the Ombudsman's power, decarbonisation of existing stock, and that was estimated by Inside Housing across the UK, £104 billion. How can we deal with all of that while continuing to develop? This is one of the biggest overarching issues for the sector. How are we going to cope with the demand that's out there? Or in some cases, do we stop developing? You know, we've seen L&Q say, well, sorry, we got to, you know, we wanted to do 10,000 homes a year. It's now going to be 3,000. We've got, I don't know, Catalyst saying we were going to do 1,300 homes. It's now going to be 1,000. And so on. So people want to continue developing, but the costs that they are facing and the changes to the way that things need to work in operational terms and planning terms around building safety, those are huge. I could go on at length.
Yeah. No, that's great, and in some respects that sort of segues nicely into our second Steve. So Steve Jackson, Wates Property. So two things that sort of wanted to start with that is some sort of insights in terms of how it's been for Wates, but more importantly, and sort of moving forward. Some of those issues around that Greg alluded to around cost pressures, material supplies, labour supply shortages, and basically that whole sort of priorities around building safety and fire. How's it been for you in terms of the work that you're doing in the sector?
Thanks, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks, Andrew, for not asking me to solve all Greg's points there. That is a list, and it just shows you the size of the task ahead of us in the sector. But again, what I have seen over the last 12 months, can't believe it's 12 months since that first webinar, is how resilient and how working in collaboration the sector has been to solve some of those problems, and also start to think about the future as opposed to dwelling too much on 2020. And first of all, from a Wates perspective, our people are our sort of primary concern, and we extended that to our people, our residents, our customers, our supply chain, anybody involved in this sector. We had to wrap our arms around and protect as best we can. From a health point of view, we wanted to get things under control and make sure we were dealing with the safety side correctly, and that was recognised certainly by the what helped the sector immensely, I think, during this stage was the Construction Leadership Council's advice to get Britain building again and get our sites open, get activity going wherever possible. But of course, following all the regulations that we needed to do to keep people safe from this devastating virus, and I think that's been important. And then we start to deal with the next stage of that, making sure we've got our customers right, making sure we're managing cash. Steve mentioned commercial enterprises need to look after cash. It's easy to forget that, and if all of a sudden you're running out of cash, you're going out of business. So profits went out the window for everybody. We focused on making sure we maintained our businesses and cash, and that kept things going. And in that period as well, maintaining order books and looking to the future was, again, there's still plenty of activity in the sector. So I think it's healthy. I think it's organised, and yeah, we did have lots of challenges. Were getting into people's homes in some instances, finding the resources that are available resources, and when you're dealing with Brexit challenges, you're dealing with taxation charges around IR35 as well. There's a whole host of issues that were given to us to deal with during this pandemic to try and just keep going and keep things moving forward. But I was immensely proud of that collaborative spirit that I saw in the sector, and going forward, I think that gives us ample opportunity to drive forward. But again, the focus remains on the people side of it. Everybody's mentioned mental health. We've talked about diversity and inclusion. We're going to have to do something different going forward in the future if we want to build our organisations to serve. Now, in terms of the second part of that question, the cost pressures and materials and labour. I mentioned labour briefly. It's going to be tough because we've got probably a large volume of Eastern European labour that we rely on in the sector that hasn't probably come back, and that's a challenge. We've seen price increases in labour rates. What we found is we're in competition sometimes in local areas amongst ourselves for direct labour to deliver our services, as well as professional teams. But we're fishing in that very small pool of talent, and therefore we desperately need to start thinking collectively how we bring and attract more people to our sector, whether that's construction, whether that's in housing. We need to think outside the proverbial box to do that, and to do that we might have to train, develop, upskill, get into the schools and colleges and show how attractive our sector is. But we also need to think about a lot of people who may have been displaced due to the pandemic, and how we can attract those displaced employees to our sector. Many years ago, through recession, lots of people leave our sector and join other sectors. Now those sectors are suffering. Can we get people back into the built environment family? So that's important. Materials, I don't even know where to start with. When you're looking at materials, it's incredible the amount of price increases that I'm looking at on our warning signs. Someone gave me a statistic around copper the other week, and it's eye-watering. And if you've got major electrical programs or anything with steel and metal-based products, we're in for a bit of a rough ride, as well as timber. And it's not just the inflation prices, it's the shortages as well. And so I think for us, it is looking at those priority areas that we want to grow in. We want to look to find the better ways that we can attack the markets that our customers are looking for. Certainly in terms of off-site manufacture, we've mentioned briefly net zero carbon. There'll be huge amounts of opportunity in that area, and huge amounts of attraction from other sectors into our sector to start to tackle that challenge ahead of us. So we can do that in a much more diverse way, and then just really thinking about our environmental impact overall. And I do think collaboratively putting our horsepowers together, we can really tackle some of those challenges that Greg alluded to and really make a difference.
That's great, Steve. Just so in terms of that, issues around stock investment, building safety, fire safety, the whole zero carbon agenda, and to some extent, as Greg pointed out, versus the priorities in terms of new builds. Steve Coffey, how do you see that from a Torus perspective? And also, perhaps, we've had a couple of questions around, again, the points that Steve was making around skills and training and how we get some better skills trade people and how we shift that employment skills gap that we've got. And I just wondered if there are any sort of insights from you in terms of what Torus are doing. You're
sort of failed my own test, didn't I? You're on mute. Yeah, so they're the key areas, aren't they? And first and foremost, I think safety is different to the other areas. If we can't keep people safe in our homes, we don't get over fair space, do we? Nothing else moves on if people aren't safe. So that's got to be sort of fair space, if that makes sense. But beyond that, we've got an opportunity to look to the long term and sort of carbon reduction, net zero, those agendas, be that through the new supply we build and MMC properties, or be that through retrofitting, is a key challenge for the sector. There's no doubt of that being a key issue going forward financially as much as anything else. But equally, if we don't build homes, we're not fulfilling our purpose, are we either? So for me, probably in that Venn diagram, all those areas come together. That bit in the middle covers safety, it covers carbon agenda and decent homes too, or whatever. It also covers the new builds and developing new homes that actually meet the housing needs of the economic proposition in local areas, and that's really, really important. But I suppose the thing that captures all of those things on the outside, so to speak, rather than the center point of the Venn diagram, is that community stuff. That's about people. And if we can get our housing offer right, I mean, I have this cheesy saying of, what's the point giving someone a lovely home to enjoy their abject poverty in? People in abject poverty and can't live, being in a lovely home is probably slightly better than being in a rubbish home, but it's marginal, isn't it? So we need to use the home as the foundation, sorry for that pun too, as the foundation for people's lives, because we know people live longer if they live in a decent home, the kids do better at school, the health is better, be that physical health or mental health. They've got a better chance of getting and sustaining a job, and they've also got less chance of being a perpetrator or a victim of crime. So the community investment is really important to us, and we can't sort of, for me, we need to do all of those things, and it's a really tough balance to get, but we can't just go down that agenda and not build new homes. We can't build new homes and not address building safety first and foremost, but also the net carbon position. So we need to really make sure that we can attack all of those agendas, because that's what people in our communities need. And we need to make sure that that fits with the economic proposition in a sort of a true localism point of view. And, you know, we haven't, I think Greg did mention it before, but, you know, Brexit on top of all this, you know, we seem to have forgotten about Brexit a little because of the sort of enormity of the pandemic. But, you know, that's such an enormous change, which is going to have such big implications for everyone. My sort of hope, really, whilst, you know, I still haven't quite got over the referendum, to be perfectly honest with you, but my genuine hope is that Liverpool all of a sudden faces the right way again, as it is in the Victorian times and everything else, and maybe we can be the gateway to Atlantic Corridor and everywhere else to the New World and everything else, and get those materials coming in via the port and then getting the economic benefits of that. But we need to attack all of those agendas in a balanced way, whilst we've got significant challenges on resources.
Thanks. That's some really great points. Moving on to you, Jenny. Again, you mentioned in your introductory remarks about your work on the review of decent homes. How do, you know, what is the voice of tenants saying about their priorities in terms of, you know, the key stock investment needs going forward?
I think safety is, you know, that's always going to be number one, isn't it? You know, there's no doubt. I totally agree with Steve there. So, but generally, and I know I'm saying this project, generally in the social housing sector, we've done a lot. We're a lot further ahead, aren't we, on all of that? And we have to, you know, recognise that, and we are making great strides. But yes, absolutely, that's the first priority. I mean, the decent homes is such an interesting one, isn't it? Because you know, the last decent homes drove so much change. Many tenants were involved in it, in terms of you know, what it meant for them and their landlords in the future. This one doesn't feel like it's going to be like that, obviously, in quite the same way. But I think the expectations of tenants have been massively raised about what might come from this decent homes review, and whether we can meet those expectations, I think, is something that's going to be very interesting to watch over the next year. I think the point that's in the white paper about the wider space, so what's decent more than your home, well, that is what's outside your door, isn't it, as well? It is the community, it is the green space that you're working with, it is what you have access to in terms of open spaces. How we knit that together with a new decent home standard is going to be hard to do, but it's clearly something that tenants say time and time again is of importance to them. If you think, you know, what do you always get when you talk to tenants as one of their key issues? Well, it's always repairs, obviously, is one of their key issues, but an ASB. But then it is that kind of, you know, my community, what the services are and the resources are in my community. Knitting all that together is going to be absolutely key. But we can't get away from, can we, that, you know, we still have too many tenants reporting to us the things that we saw, you know, unfortunately from Croydon a few weeks ago, that people are still living in those conditions, and we've got to get a grip of that as a sector. There'll be reasons for all of that happening, but we, you know, that cannot be allowed to continue if the trust, transparency, all of what we talk about is going to be there in the sector for some of these bigger pieces of investment decisions we've got to make further down the line. So go back to my point about some of the basics, right? That is what we have to focus on, in my view. Right here today, as well as being expansive in terms of what decent homes the next level might look like.
Thanks. So Greg, I mean, Steve suggested that the priority should be all three of these. I mean, is there an emerging view that, yes, that's right, but resources may dictate that, again, we might have to prioritize in one way or the other? What's your view on the sort of those key investment priorities, again, versus perhaps new build and so on? Does something have to cut the slack?
Jenny's right, Steve's right, that building safety has to come first. And that can't be ducked. And the welter of demands that are coming forward on that, from government through legislation and practice, you know, and this operates in various ways. I mean, I touched on the Ombudsman. I mean, the Ombudsman is now higher profile that service than they've ever been, and indeed the Ombudsman himself is, as we know, close to government, and the naming and shaming of social landlords that have failed to cut the mustard and look after their tenants properly and their tenants' complaints is a growing one, and this is all very immediate, but there is a wider danger if this happens at the expense of new development, because we know perfectly well that housing demand is not going anywhere. If anything, it's increasing. Yes, a number of steps were put in place to deal with people in the most extreme housing needs, street homeless people and so forth during the pandemic, but those are coming to an end. What follows on from it? And that's a challenge that isn't an easy one to resolve, because bluntly, there isn't enough funding in the Affordable Homes Programme. The funding that there is comes with strings around sort of shared ownership and right to shared ownership and so on. Even then, grant levels are inadequate. So new approaches are needed. What an increasing number of social landlords are looking towards is institutional and commercial investment, which, well, I mean, in an immediate sense, there is no, you know, there is probably no choice. There is a lot of money out there. Investors are coming towards the sector. I think one needs to be careful about who one's dealing with and on what sort of terms and what their expectations are as far as returns go. But that seems to have thus far affected the supported living, independent living space, particularly in terms of mainstream. You know, when one sees an institution like Legal and General come forward, looking to partner with the sector, one can take a degree of comfort from it, because, and you know, I and my colleagues have done quite a lot of work with Legal and General. One thing that's interesting for a commercial organisation, they are absolutely crystal clear, focused on the fact that they are looking after millions of people's pension money. They do not want anything that will affect their reputation. So when we were helping them select what was eventually a panel of 14 partners to do management and maintenance for them, at least over the initial period as they're growing their portfolio, there were really high standards that people had to meet in terms of the quality of their delivery. You know, more broadly, I mean, there's an interesting article which Ian McDermott, chief exec of Catalyst, wrote, which is a sort of blog on our website last week, which has got a lot of people talking around G15 and other housing associations, saying basically, well, I mean, it was saying a number of things, but I mean, if anybody's interested, go to our website, you'll find it. But it was saying that housing associations cannot afford to let to sort of shy away from, you know, in the face of all of these financial and other challenges, building new homes and finding ways to build and fund new homes, because if they don't, they will go the way of, and what Ian's analogy is the US steel industry. It's really quite an interesting piece, quite a thoughtful piece. And associations, in that sense, if they go too far down that road, will become management-only organisations and will fall behind. and leave that space to commercial providers, whether it's Legal and General or Sage backed by Blackstone or M&G or whoever it might be. So this debate is very live at the moment. Not all of the pieces fit together. You cannot square the government saying we want 300,000 homes, and we know that typically overall house building targets, about a quarter to a third are built by the social sector, housing associations and local authorities. It won't happen without us, but there isn't enough. But there isn't enough money coming in. And if you link that to well, don't even get me started on the planning reforms.
Okay, so Steve, I know Wates have been launching some fairly major initiatives around the whole sort of zero carbon agenda. How do you see that area of investment going, and do you see that as a priority for the sort of the sector clients that you're working with? You're on the dreaded mute, Steve.
You never get over it, do you? Yeah, I mean, there is we're in the middle of a climate crisis. Let's face it, it isn't coming. It's already here. We're seeing the effects of it already. I think what we did. I think I remember saying it last time I was on a year ago that it was in 2019 when I attended some groups up in Manchester to look at the impact of the carbon challenge on our housing stock, and it inspired me to start looking at different ways that we could bring the offer to the market to help our clients with net zero carbon. But then of course COVID hit and everything went on the back burner, and then around about September time, October time, when we started to see that flicker at the end of the tunnel, it started to build momentum, and we had a lot of customers asking questions. We had obviously the government putting various degrees of funding out there, some successful, some not so. And then the challenge became real really quickly with the amount of pilots that were out there, and we started having lots of conversations with our customers. And of course, funding often comes with a degree of regulation behind it, so you have to make sure you're accredited in the right way, which as you know, we are, and we've already started now working up a few schemes with a few schemes on site and a few schemes in the pipeline, and this is all pilots. It's all about knowledge gaining. And the biggest sort of challenge that I'm finding is it's easy to set up and it's easy to deliver a net zero carbon offer for our customers, but it's also another challenge getting things done, and that means getting people who understand design, people understand the process, and supply chain out there, enough supply chain out there to bring in the new technologies and skills, because it's not all about new fancy mechanical technologies. Some of it is just really really good building practices, and I liken it to my days back at university, looking at Chudley and thinking if we just built stuff right in the first place, we wouldn't have so much problems with the quality of our buildings. And of course, a few years ago now we saw the impacts of getting it wrong fundamentally. So I do think there's a huge opportunity around net zero carbon, but what we're finding to have more really tangible conversations with our customer is looking at what the decent homes program, they're maintaining their existing stock, and the 10 to 30 year pipeline is going to be, and how we can then influence that work in the future with a really good powerful net zero carbon as though it's part of the business. So I never saw net zero carbon being an addition to the work that's already going out there. I always saw it as if we just do it right in the first place and degas properties and change what we put onto properties and in properties, it'll make a difference. And of course, you've got the new build element about making sure what we're delivering as new stock is fit for the future, and the fact that we're not building now and then changing in 10 years down the line. We've got to start thinking progressively on that journey, and it's quite an interesting journey from a people who are out there, and it's only when you put yourself out there and you open up your websites and you stand, you sit in front of quite a lot of forums and talk about this, that you get people knocking on the door, asking a few questions and offering their services and offering their businesses. And we do this pretty well through what we call the Win portal. It's on our Wates website. And what we're doing is we're trying to attract new startup companies, new technologies, advanced technologies to showcase their products on our webpage. And we try and connect as many of those companies, small, medium-sized enterprises, some social enterprises, to our customer group, and they're bringing innovation, they're bringing energy saving innovation, building optimization technology innovation, and we're just trying to help these organizations get on the map, get themselves noticed. And that's had a degree of success from just general solutions of innovation. I think there's over 125 organizations on there, and then the recent drive towards green solutions has attracted 42. And we don't just get people to come on and put them on. They're almost, I like to say, it's like a Dragon's Den event. They go through a screening panel where we all sit there as dragons and without the cash, and we help select them. This panel is a degree of experts from all over, looking at business to technology to cost, to even just to making sure that if we're putting it into people's homes, residents can easily understand why that bit of technology is being used on the house. And and often there's some of these innovations where you can connect directly into a property and speak to a resident really quickly, and help them understand the use of a building. Is just, it feels like 10 years away from us, but it's actually here now, and it's just about promoting that. So I think, for me, it's a big investment area, as much as looking at, the reorganization of our business to look at this new tech, but to also look at what we need to do in the future to offer our customers. And so far, I think it links to net zero carbon. I think the government have mentioned it an awful lot as well about skills, getting Britain building, getting the economy moving. Net zero carbon will help contribute to that, and I see it as 2050 target, but that'll come around soon enough. But with some targets of 2030 that I've heard, 2035, they'll be coming around really, really quickly, and we do need to start again collaborating, really planning this through, getting a lot of energy behind it, and it'll make a difference, I'm sure.
Okay, that's brilliant. I'm going to move on to our sort of next topic around the return of the regulator. I suppose some people are describing it, but that whole sort of thing around consumer regulation, resident engagement. I know some were slightly disappointed that the Queen's Speak doesn't specifically seems to make provision for the social housing white paper, but clearly building safety regulator will be back in, and clearly the sector is committed to hearing the voice of residents, and quite rightly so. So Jenny, what's your take on the future of consumer regulation and resident engagement?
Yeah, I mean, it was disappointing yesterday that it wasn't mentioned and specific. But that said, I mean, we said in our statement, TPAS on it yesterday, is we are heartened by the progress that is going on behind the scenes, if you like, in the regulator. There is significant progress going on, waiting for when the timetable allows. We would have liked a more public statement yesterday. Otherwise, I think what's going to start building is this sense that tenants are just being almost dangled with the regulatory framework. But I do have to say, given what we're seeing from the Housing Ombudsman coming out, which is impressive, and what we know is going on in the regulator, getting ready for consumer regulation, this isn't going to unwind anytime soon. And what else is happening is there's other pressures coming to bear, isn't there? I mean, I've always talked about why you do engagement. I'm not going to go on about it, but we've always talked about it's a business case to do engagement. I think we're all landing that. We all understand that. If you want to get your services better, get involved, get talking to tenants. There's always been a social reason to do it, and even more so now, given that people are isolated, given the mental health issues that we've got out there. So we're playing on that. We've been waiting for a long time for the regulatory piece, the final piece to say, you know, some people unfortunately will need regulation to make them come to the table on this. And that's just the reality of where we are, and we're pleased to see that. I think at the centre of all of that is safety. Now that's what's been layered on since Grenfell. So everything's aligning in the right direction. We are talking to boards far more than we've ever done directly about engagement and hearing customer voice. So that's a change. That's, you know, that is landing now with boards. They recognise this is coming. I think we are hearing the right things from the regulator in terms of what even the inspection in the, you know, when that comes in a couple of years, what that might look like. And again, if you talk to tenants, that inspection piece of the regulatory framework really excites them. That's the bit that they feel will have the real teeth, will have the real truth, will enable a regulator to really see and question what is going on at an organisation. I think what we've got with the time scales that we've got for all this to be implemented is time, and time for organisations to get this absolutely right, to really work with their tenants to get the right things in place for their organisation. Nobody, I hope, is rushing off and thinking that what they've read in the white paper is everything finalised, but are actually starting to work with tenants to really think what that framework will look like in your own organisation. So I'm seeing some really, I don't know what the right word, but, you know, really sensible, grown-up, adult conversations going on in organisations to get this right for the long term. I think you've also got to look at things like, you know, you've not only got the Ombudsman as part of this jigsaw, MHCLG and the regulator, but we've got the building safety regulator part of this jigsaw now. We've got things like the Nat Feds Code of Governance, really helpful in starting to, again, cement resident engagement right at the forward thinking of boards. And I think also in this is we're having a lot of conversation is where are people like Wates, where are contractors in this relationship? And this is about relationships at the end of the day, isn't it? When the regulator comes to talk or wants to see evidence, they want to see the evidence for that organisation, not a tick box. And people are going to have to, you know, work their partnerships really hard to say, is everything that we're trying to deliver in this organisation aligned to what tenants' priorities are? And I'm hearing that so much more now, which is wonderful. You know, actually, what are the priorities of my business? Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to work out what tenants' priorities are. And if they're completely misaligned, then I've got something very, very wrong indeed, haven't I? And some people are going back to sort of the drawing board almost and starting again. And that's the right way to do it, isn't it? So whilst the timetable is frustrating for many people, and you know, it is too long, you know, since Grenfell, green paper, now white paper, it is all taking far too long. But the general direction, I think the messages are landing, and I think the sector's working really hard to make this time the time it embeds for the long term.
Yeah, and Steve, move on to you, Steve Coffey. I know Torus aren't waiting for the regulator to put the voice of tenants at the heart of the organisation, but perhaps you could share some of your thoughts on how that resident voice can be heard.
I think that, you know, I think Jenny's articulated an excellent way there, and it's hard to sort of add much in what she's saying from a very sort of macro level. I do think, before I get into Andrew, there's one thing that disappoints me about our sector, the RPs, is that, you know, we moan about regulation, and then but we want a formulaic dot-to-dot exercise to say we comply with something. And I think, you know, if you look at our approaches to benchmarking, sometimes, you know, we love the benchmarks that make us look good, and we explain that the ones that make us look bad aren't really a true measure, and we shouldn't really look at them. And, you know, both of those things can't be right, can they? And it needs not to be a formulaic or a tokenistic sort of approach thing. The fact of the matter is, there's got to be that symbiotic relationship with tenants, as Jenny said. You know, if your strategic aspirations as a housing provider are at odds with what your tenant population wants to do, there's a fundamental disconnect there, isn't there? Do you know what I mean? And so we need to make sure that that's there. I also think, you know, all of this is great, and what's not to like about consumer regulation, you know, and we, you know, with regulation generally we swing from an over-regulated situation to an under-regulated one, and never seem to get it right. But I think there's an elephant in the room as well, and the elephant in the room is legitimacy. And I think that, you know, I think people get accountability through democracy, so councillors and MPs and whatever, people understand that. They also understand shareholder, private sector accountability. We're a bit in the middle, and where does our legitimacy come from? Is it the self-appointed great and the good on all the boards and everything else? And how do we make sure that we've got that legitimacy and that accountability? And all the things Jenny mentioned are the ways in which we can put some proxies in for that ultimate requirement. At Torus, for instance, what we've done is, you know, we've gone down the route in LMH, for instance, prior to the amalgamation that created Torus. We were created with a tenant majority on our board, you know, so we had an inbuilt tenant majority set in that direction, and tenants were. The reality was, and we've had some fantastic tenants on our board who are as articulate and experienced as any independent non-tenants we've had on our board. But lots of tenants are interested in that things that impact their day-to-day lives. So, you know, ASB, repairs, investment standards, all of the neighbourhoods, all those things is where, and less so about the technicalities of treasury management or some other things that send most of us to sleep at one time or another. So we've come up with a position where, for our accountability, as you'll know, Andrew, we've got our Landlords Operations Committee. So we delegate all of our landlord activities to a committee that's got the delegations to provide those services, to have proper oversight of those services. We've got a tenant majority on that committee. We've got representatives from the local authorities in our key heartland areas to make sure that we're grounded, but then there's clear linkages to the board through those delegations to make sure that we've got that golden thread, so that we can make sure that our tenant engagement, tenant voice is appropriate in the circumstances, whether that's coming from a street level and a community level right the way through to the board level. And I think something else we picked up from the health service, actually, which I think is a fantastic thing, is tenant stories. Like the health service has patient stories, and sort of actually getting into the detail of when something goes wrong. Well, let's ask those tenants to come in and explain to us what we got wrong and how we can learn from those things, and not you know, get up ourselves a little bit and how strategic we are and everything else. Let's learn about the practicalities of the impacts on people's lives this had. But equally, let's get some really good things we do and ask some tenants to come in and talk to us about some good things we do. So it's a mosaic, it's a jigsaw, I think, as Jenny said before, about making sure that all of these tools that we can deploy appropriately right across the piece. We're trying to be proactive, but we also accept that, you know, other people have great ideas and how it could be done, and we're perfectly happy to pinch those ideas off anyone.
Excellent. So I'm going to come to you next, Steve Jackson, and picking up that point that Jenny made. You know, as a commercial contract, how do you ensure that the voice of the residents and that your ultimate customers are heard in the work that you do? Again, press the button, Steve.
One day. Steve mentioned it at the head of the webinar, really, around you know, people have got a right to live safely in their homes, and that is our license to trade, and that has to be, you know, it's number one on everybody's you know, agendas when they're talking about resident tenant safety. And I think we've worked with an audacious club for TPAS now. We've worked with TPAS for many years, as long as I can remember, and just utilising very good tools. And I look at it now and think we would, during the decent homes days, you know, many years ago, we were on this, and we had, as Steve mentioned, you know, many meetings I went to, and there was a board there, and you it was a very professional meeting, and we were surrounded by the voice of the resident groups, and they made us better people for it, and we had a better understanding that it wasn't just about the bricks and mortar and the kitchens and the windows we were putting into buildings. It was about, this is somebody's home, just communicate well with us, and that's the big piece. It's about that communication. And when you look at the charters that a lot of people talk about now, they are sensible charters that you'd expect to be doing, whether there's a Grenfell or not. And a tragedy like that has reminded us how important it is to have got that capacity. And for us, it's about making sure anybody who enters organised understands the power of the resident and the link that we have clients and we have customers. And you've got to understand there's different types of people in every organisation, but everyone individual, and just personal contact, that respect for people all the way through our journey, just makes it easier for us to understand, and formalising that into degrees of processes, in various core group meetings, and monitoring that feedback. And as Steve said, that you monitor the feedback, and it might not be great, and you might be having a bad run on a project with the residents, and if you're not listening to what those complaints are and getting to the heart of the matter, or you're trying to gloss it over and ignore it, it's just going to get worse. And then when that swell of energy comes from resident groups to a really big problem for your customer, you've got a problem as a contractor. And if you don't grab hold of it, deal with it, talk to residents, and do something about it, and show them what you're doing, reset the targets, reset your initiatives, reset the process, and report against it, and then bring residents in to challenge you and help you find the right way to do things. It's just good common sense practice, I would suggest, and I'm maybe slightly tainted the fact that I've been here in the housing sector for a long time. But I've seen really good practice, and I would say it's very rare you get it completely wrong, and it is always good to check in. It's always good to have a chart on every project, but more important, it's always good to train your people, train them well, give them the tools, make sure that you've got that communication with your with the residents as a part of your business and as a part of your project, and make sure it's really entwined with everything you're doing. And I use the word entwined. Steve used golden thread. It is that thread. It is making sure when we're interacting, we're doing it professionally, we're delivering quality work, we're delivering safe work, and you know what? 9 times out of 10 that's happening out there, and it's really effective. But we should always be listening and improving our processes.
Okay, thanks. Good. Greg, what are your thoughts?
I'd substantially agree with what Jenny in particular was saying, and also Steve, Torus Steve. Yes, it was disappointing that the white paper, that the Queen's speech yesterday wasn't looking at implementation of key areas in this respect of the social housing white paper from November. But to be honest, I mean, it was being said after that the white paper was issued that it would take between 1 and 4 years. This is what was coming out of the department. It would take between 1 and 4 years before all of the elements in there were turned into legislation. The reality is that the environment has moved on quite considerably from 10 years ago, when the current Secretary of State for Transport was the then housing minister, saying things like the TSA is toast, and saying that all of the focus of regulation here is his boss, Lord Pickles, was saying that all of the focus should be on simply governance and financial viability, and regulation should be hands off. And for some years now, recognizing that change of emphasis, if you like, well, essentially post Grenfell, the regulator has been using, I wouldn't want to suggest for a moment that this is by the back door. I think it's been quite legitimate. The regulator has been using governance assessments of RPs as a proxy, if you like, for consumer regulation issues. It's not the full Monty of consumer regulation issues, but areas like gas safety, rent standard compliance, and so on, where RPs have been falling down in those areas, that's been identified as a governance issue in the sense that it indicates problems with organisations' data integrity and internal reporting within the governance framework, because no organisation in their right mind would accept less than 100% compliance with gas safety inspections, for example. So other aspects where the environment has moved on. The Ombudsman over the last year 18 months has had significant increase in authority, and we know that the regulator, that the RSH is working closely with the Ombudsman. The regulator is currently consulting on tenant satisfaction measures as anticipated in the white paper. Clearly, those are going to feature in future in-depth assessments. It's about, you know, how and looking at how good an organisation's collection of data is around those sort of measures. The measures in themselves that I've seen, the draft ones they're consulting on, are not that dramatic. I mean, it's sort of taking the sort of thing that's been in STAR for a number of years and moving it on a little bit, but actually focusing on reporting that is going to be important. And the messages from the regulator are clear. Do not wait for legislation, because, hey, we all know the reality. When it comes to active regulation of consumer standards these sort of issues being addressed in IDAs, as well as in inspection visits, any social landlord that tries and starts or restarts, for example, its tenant engagement a couple of months before the regulator comes to see them, well, they're going to catch a cropper fairly quickly, because, you know, tenants are going to turn around and say, look at this, the paint's still wet. They're not serious at all. So a responsible landlord should already be doing these things, but even those that aren't quite as responsible as that, they'll be daft if they don't take them seriously. It's no accident that the regulator has already recruited a director of consumer regulation. We can expect a lot more activity on this, in a sense, running ahead of legislation.
Great, that's fine. We've got sort of just under 10 minutes left, so sort of panel, please do bear that in mind. I'm going to talk about. I mean, we started with some of these comments, but let's sort of talk about the future of employment and work. I'm going to start with you, Steve Jackson. I know the construction sector has had a lot of issues around safe ways of working, and again, some of those restrictions may lift. But how do you see the future in terms of employment and work? I can't hear you, Steve. I don't know if just me. No. We seem to have lost Steve. Can you? Are you there? No, we've lost you. Let's move on to Jenny. Jenny, and hopefully we'll get Steve back in a minute.
I think we covered quite a bit of it. I think that in terms of the future, I'm just checking on home. You can hear me. Diversity and inclusion, we've used that. We've mentioned that before.
I tell you what, we're losing you, Steve. So, Jenny, do you want to?
Yeah, very quickly.
Can you hear me? I'm here.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Carry on. Okay, so I mean, just very quickly, I'm just going to say probably things we've mentioned before, but I think the future of employment and work, we know, you know, the whole question about staff in offices, how that's going to play out. I think we're talking about that a lot. I mean, I'm a chair of an ALMO as well, so you know, I see it from all sides. How are we going to land that back, that our staff feel safe, comfortable working in offices again, but also what impact is that going to have on the services for our customers? I think we have to really look back now. We've got a bit more breathing space, a little, to think about what did we learn from last year, what worked well. You know I've said it a million times, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but you know, from the presentation, the phone call worked well for many tenants. You know, many organisations are carrying on with that, checking in with residents, just having a relationship that's about how are you, you know, how can we help you, what can we do to just improve bits of your life that's not about transactional customer stuff. It's that other side of the business. I think social housing landlords are brilliant at. So I think that will continue. I think there's real opportunities for where you get your staff from. So again, I think it's a real, you know, question for organisations. Well, take my, you know, Stockport Homes, where I'm chair of. You know, we can really start to question, where do you bring staff from now? Do staff need to be based, you know, within an hour from Stockport to be able to work in an office? Can they be based anywhere? You know, TPAS is the same. We cover the whole of England. We've always had people working from home. But what does that mean about who you can actually go after in terms of real talents that work in your organisations? I think this could be really exciting. The flip side from the tenant's perspective is tenants love to think people are local and close to them and have that connection to their home. And so we have to find a way to make sure that people still feel that people understand, the people that work in landlords understand the communities that people are living in. I think there's a real issue around if people are going to be working from home, particularly if we're managing flats, what are we doing around the digital connectivity for people? What are we doing about broadband access for people, for our residents? How can we help them get access to that opportunity about jobs all over the country by providing some of the infrastructure people are going to need to be able to do that? I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure I'll pick other points up.
Brilliant. Steve Coffey, I will come back to Steve Jackson in a minute. So how do you see the future?
Oh, I'll be very quick, Andrew. I think, you know, flexible, agile, brilliant. Giving up people that ability to work at home, work from other locations. So, for instance, it's not so much about our offices. Why can't our staff work out of one of our extra care schemes or somewhere else and bring that vibrance into that community? So that agile is a much broader thing than just talking about the office for me. But there's another aspect of, we don't want all to be remote. How do you embed your culture when you see someone every 6 months or something? It's a different way of embedding, a totally different way of doing business, and people spark off each other, and that, you know, that sort of water butt conversation or kitchen conversation when you're making a drink, and all those things are very valuable as well. And how do we not lose that by moving forward? So we need to be very agile in that respect. Also for tenants, nudging tenants towards digital is great, and digital access is fabulous. But for me, there's always got to be that personal face-to-face option for people. So nudging is great. Forcing people down a digital route is not the answer for me. That we want to be able to offer people that personal service as well. And then the final thing, which is a totally different debate, I don't think we can get on now, but town centres and city centres are a big concern, as people aren't working in those areas anymore. And economically and everything else, how do we make sure that there's a vibrance in those areas when everyone's being sort of dragged out of those areas at the moment and leaving a vacuum behind them? But that's probably another seminar and another day.
Yeah, brilliant, Greg, and then we'll finish with the other Steve.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, I agree with everything that Jenny and Steve have just said, so I won't cover that ground, but I will pick up on Steve's last point, because I think that what this links to in terms of the way we live, where we live, is fascinating and one of the most exciting aspects. you know, there need to be some positives that come out of this awful year or year plus that we've had. I think what we're going to be seeing is a lot more people moving out of town centres and city centres to more distant but still commutable areas where they can get larger homes, more space to work from home, more green space, and on the basis that in many cases they're only going to be commuting in 2 days a week, let's say, to the office or the hub or whatever it might be, they won't mind so much a longer journey. And on the other side, taking account of the decline of the demand for commercial space and in-store retail, I think we're going to see over time people moving into areas that were previously confined to business or retail, where those spaces can be repurposed. So, you know, I'm not going to go on about the 15-minute city, the 15-minute neighbourhood. That is indeed a whole seminar in itself. And I think these issues are fascinating, but there are major challenges here, positive challenges, I think, in the main for regeneration policymakers, planners, developers, architects, local authorities and communities. And of course, it's not all just about moving housing into vacant spaces in town centres. Look at what Stockton-on-Tees have been doing with, you know, in terms of knocking down a high street and creating parks and leisure and recreation. As I say, it's a whole other debate.
Okay, brilliant, Steve. Hopefully we can hear you now. Can we hear you? No. You don't. We seem to have lost Steve altogether. That's which is a real shame. Anyway, so I think I'll wrap up there, and I know conscious of time, and just to say a real big thank you to the panel, so to Jenny, Steve, Greg and Steve. Sorry that we couldn't hear Steve's comments there at the end. Thank you, the audience, for being there. There's some real insights that have been shared by the panel. A really great session. So thank you all for attending, and you know, again, stay safe, but you know, let's hope we do all meet up together sometime in the not too distant future, because again, I think it was Steve Coffey said there's nothing more important than people, and people are intent on being together, and that's what we should be. So let's hope we can do that soon, but keep safe, keep having the jab or second jab or whatever it is, and yeah, let's meet soon. Thanks and good afternoon.
Okay, bye.